a game recently because I played like an absolute idiot. It was a game of Commander and player C was miles behind, having missed a land drop while everyone else was developing their board and hitting their land drops. They cast the Smothering Tithe on like turn 5 or 6 once finally getting to 4 mana and proceeded to pass the turn. At which point I myself decided to not pay for the Smothering Tithe. This then got out of control as the next player didn't pay for the Smothering Tithe and the next player didn't pay for the Smothering Tithe, and before you knew it, the player who was the furthest behind in the game was now the furthest ahead. I considered paying for the Smothering Tithe, but I believed it put me too far behind on the turn I was taking. I think I was playing a key piece myself, but it didn't matter. The amount of mana the opponent got on playing my deck as well, they were borrowing Vihan, it got them way ahead, both in damage output and in mana. I would go as far as to say that if I was describing this in like MOBA terms, or perhaps any other game where there's a resource system for like getting killed, maybe even Counter-Strike.
Boom, headshot! What can I say? There's nothing like the rush of hunting people down and killing them.
I would say I fed my opponent. The League of Legends wiki describes feeding as a term that generally refers to the act of dying to the enemy and thus giving them kill rewards repeatedly. In League of Legends, when you die, it gives the opponent gold. Gold is then used to purchase items that makes them more powerful, and thus they'll probably kill you again, and you can kind of like snowball out of control if the person doing the feeding doesn't calm the fuck down and play a bit more conservatively.
An enemy is godlike.
I think there are multiple cards in Magic the Gathering that cause players, especially at casual or lower power levels or lower skill levels, dare I say, to feed. Rhystic Study, Smothering Tithe, and a third one that I'll come to in a moment. They're just some of the examples of this where you can feed an opponent. You can feed them resources to become a lovely, fat little cat. Hell, in Magic we've already got Don't Feed the Fish, which is you let a Mystic Remora like rotate around the table a couple of times and die off due to the upkeep cost not getting paid, and thus you haven't fed the player with the fish, because it's temporary. However, Smothering Tithe and Rhystic Study often make people perform quite significantly differently because the cards don't go away. At some point, someone's got to kill the object to stop this happening. Further to that, Smothering Tithe is a whole different fish. Kettle of fish. Yeah. Smothering Tithe asks you to pay 2, and it asks you to pay 2 on an action that you cannot choose not to take in your turn. With something like Rhystic Study, you can choose to not cast a spell and pass the turn. Sometimes inaction is better than action. It's a thing that I might do a video about. But Smothering don't give a fuck. Smothering, we're in your doorstep. Do you pay the 2, bitch? And it's 2 as well, not 1. I'm going to come to that towards the end of the video about how Smothering Tithe kind of boils my piss compared to the other cards in this video. So let's talk about the act of feeding. And also, on top of that, talk about teamwork and collaboration. Because when it comes to Commander, as many people often observe, it's like a game of Monopoly or like a game of D&D. And on this channel, I've said, no, not really, because someone has to win. And Monopoly, no one wins, everybody loses. And in D&D, it's not really a winning thing. But the bit that I've brushed over in those past videos is that actually is like those, in the sense that the table, well, actually, no, it's nothing like fucking Monopoly. Monopoly's dog shit. But D&D, everyone collaborates for a good time. And that's the case in terms of the social contract of EDH, but also in the fact that 3 of you need to stop one other person from winning constantly. I'll talk more about that in this video. And if you want to buy single or sealed products in the North Americas, go to coolstuffinc.com and use the code Kenobi at checkout to get 5% off your order and help support the show. And if you're in Europe, you can use the on-screen code now and go to magicmadhouse.co.uk to buy your singles and sealed product and get you 5% off your order. That includes cards from Final Fantasy that are on sale now, as well as other things outside of Magic, like other card games and even Warhammer. There's a tweet recently from Toothy MTG1 that said this card would be strictly better than Rhystic Study, but I suspect it would not see play if it existed, which is 3 mana enchantment, spells your opponent's cast cost 1 more to cast. Rhystic Study is a card that you can compare, as I often do, to Sphere of Resistance or Thorn of the Amethyst. Both of those cards make spells cost 1 more, similar to our classic baby girl, Thalia. However, Rhystic Study says, quite importantly, opponents. There's no parity here that you have to break. Rhystic Study actually just is one of the best stats cards ever printed in many ways, except it gives your opponents a choice. That's the downside for getting this one-sided stacks element. Rhystic Study was part of a cycle. There were other Rhystic cards where, like, if you paid 1, you could stop stuff. The tutor is particularly bad, but the land takes the biscuit for being one of the worst lands ever printed. However, Rhystic Studies instead is one of the, if not the best card draw engines in Commander. I actually retweeted that original tweet saying the power of Rhystic Study is how stupid your opponents want to play, and I am not exempt from being that stupid opponent. When I tweeted that, someone told me I was bullying, that I was a bully, that I was like a bully that they had at school because I called someone stupid or said someone was stupid. That person's a fucking idiot. That person is stupid. I'm going to bully you and it's gonna make you come. The correct way to play into Rhystic Study, like 90% of the time, is to not feed the player who is playing the Rhystic Study. This feels like a very obvious statement to make, but I'm gonna examine it a bit further. Like, that tweet got me thinking, playing and some games I had recently, including the game I lost to Smothering Tithe, all had me thinking about this more in depth. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below if you believe there are actually like quite a lot of instances where you should just play your spells anyway. Like playing a Haymaker, like winning the game, obviously you just play through into the Rhystic Study and let the player draw their cards, of course. If you're not winning the game, there should be a very good reason for you doing so. Like you're playing something that is absolutely backbreaking and will secure the win in a turn rotation, for example. You're blowing up the Rhystic Study, for example. That might be worth just giving them their card back to do it a turn earlier to allow everyone to develop the board state. But the act of feeding the fish, feeding the Rhystic Study, feeding the Smothering Tithe player, the act of feeding has a knock-on effect on a game beyond just giving one player a load of resources. In the game where I fed into the Smothering Tithe, I'm pretty sure my opponents might have considered paying for it. But the moment I didn't pay for it as the next player in the turn rotation, it immediately gave them a signal that they're not going to bother either. The damage is already done, perhaps, or that's just the culture of the table. We're all chill, we're just going to slam a gem our spells and see where the chips fall. And the chips will often fall with a person who's been fed through a Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe winning. That's what happens. When those chips land, those shitty chips, that's the situation. So let's talk about those resources that these cards give to one particular player. It is empowering, like I said, one player, one opponent. And what I think people need to realize is that a game of Commander isn't just about winning per se, it's about stopping other people from winning as well. At any given time in Commander, 3 players are trying to stop one player from winning as opposed to just one player trying to win. That seems like a very obvious statement, but I think it's worth like adjusting your viewpoint of Commander because it gives you a better framework to negotiate with the table. At super higher levels of Commander, including CEDH, people will discuss openly whether or not they can stop another player from combo killing the table. And that will then adjust how they maneuver through a turn, what things they do, what actions they take. Like, for example, playing some sort of stacks piece that would stop player B from stopping player C from comboing, but turning off interaction, for example, turning off instant speed interaction. One particularly interesting interaction I've seen a few times is that Rhystic Study might be in play, but the player who owns the study is not the one comboing. Let's say player D is now comboing. Player B can't stop the combo, but they can cast a spell that doesn't really matter to trigger the Rhystic Study, not pay, and let player B, who has to study, draw a card, and thus perhaps draw a free, or depending on how the mana is, an interaction spell that might stop the combo. It's collaborative as a game experience until it's not, essentially. Like when someone plays an insurmountable board state, someone at the table should ask the question, can any of you deal with this? And this is the thing that when playing with newer players, and I've played with a lot of new players in the last couple of months, I just don't see very often. New players don't come in with that idea. That culture's not bred into them, and Magic doesn't really instill that either. I don't even think the gameplay shows that are so popular have that as a conversation either. Maybe it's the nature of just being fairly banterous and entertainment. I mean, I've been on some of these gameplay shows too, so I'm not criticizing Asaka, I'm better than them kind of thing, but I don't think they cultivate this idea that people should perhaps take the effort to work together to stop another player winning. But like I said, that does happen at a higher level. So in essence, your actions have consequences. If you look to feed your opponent, that's going to end up losing the game for not just you, but 2 other players. But beyond that, not just the winning and losing, let's talk a moment about how your actions affect other people's feelings and emotions. Yeah, that's right, this is the most airy-fairy part of the video, but I think if you are going to just willy-nilly never ever like pay for a Rhystic Remora, an Esper Sentinel, a Rhystic Study, then you are throwing the game a little. And of course, winning isn't everything, but people sit down to have a game that they have a chance at. If you're just gonna let one player draw 5 more cards than everyone else at the table, well, what the fuck are you even playing? I think basically intentionally feeding and intentionally throwing a game of Commander can be a very frustrating experience for the other people at the table. And I think people need to realize that. People need to be a lot more responsible about how their actions affect other people's time and energy levels. There's nothing worse than only getting to play 1 or 2 games of Commander a week at your game store to have one of those Commander games completely derailed by someone who's acting very fucking stupid. Now, of course, not everyone has seen this video or even understands how these cards work. A lot of new players get absolutely beaten over the head with these cards and don't really understand why they're never winning or having fun. I heard a player recently talk about how there are other players at the table that play Rhystic Studies and Smothering Tithes in games where the other players don't have access to those kinds of cards. There's a power imbalance and a lack of a rule zero conversation happening there, right? But even then, I think the power balances of games of Magic can be shifted via the multiplayer element. I've talked about this before in Party Box, where you get like a 10,000 power Yu-Gi-Oh creature to play in a game of Magic, and it tends not to win the game because 3 to 5 other players are playing your stupid multiplayer game and they can all interact with it. People want to keep people in and stop people from dying because they're allies against the big threat. Game Nights even did a thing where they analysed all the content at that time about how Sol Ring on turn 1 actually decreased your chances of winning because it upset the rest of the table and made you public enemy number 1, the primary target for everyone's interaction and ire. The problem with Smothering Tithe and Rhystic Study is that those cards definitely shift the power balance toward the player casting them, but if everyone else just disrespects the fuck out of them and doesn't play around them by paying into them, then the balancing factor doesn't really matter. 3 players having 3 resources doesn't matter if each of those players is giving the original player a resource to counteract that, giving them 3 cards. Of course, those 2 players have more mana just by the nature of like 3 players' entire turn activations and not the action economy. I'm not going to go too much into that, but you see my point? Someone plays a solving on turn 1, upset the table, you can do what you want. The solving player's ahead, but they're not getting further ahead. Play a Smothering Tithe or Rhystic Study and the rest of the table just doesn't respect it. They're getting further and further ahead every time you feed. You're feeding them resources. I might do a whole video on cards that just get better and better the more dumb the table plays. And let me just like clarify dumb and stupid that I'm using in this video in case the guy who thinks I'm a school bully is watching. Look, I play dumb and I play stupid all the time. Those words aren't the harsh criticisms of human beings that you think they are. It's not that fucking deep, bro, says the man making a 20-minute video about feeding people in Commander, a multiplayer format where nothing fucking matters. The stakes have never been lower, but my time is still valuable. Please play slightly better than you currently are. That was a message to myself. So I might end up making a video where people can play wrong and incorrectly and be stupid. Like, an example of that is that's not necessarily feeding per se. Oh no, it kind of is. This is my 3rd example for the video that I mentioned at the beginning, but this is just one side example. Like a Council's Judgment or a Shell game. I love these cards. I've done a whole video talking about how voting cards are super exciting and interesting for a social format because they provoke conversation at the table. I think more people should play these cards. Of course, people can play them wrong. People can ignore the rest of the table and just do what they think is best. And then in hindsight, about 2 minutes later, they realize, oh fuck, I really should have got rid of that Rhystic Study. Now, most people can't like resolving a Council's Judgment should be targeting that fucking Rhystic Study, but it would amaze you that sometimes people don't. But that's a whole different kettle of fish. That's about like just growing as players in general, understanding what the threat is and who the threat is. But like, if you don't listen to the rest of the table and you do things like voting in a way that allows the Council's Judgment player to tie their vote and similar things like that, that can also be throwing. Now, there's an absolutely delicate balance here of like how much you should listen to the table, how much you take your own play into mind, how much you really want to converse with other people whose ultimately best interests aren't like their primary goal. These people also want to win, and they also want to make you make suboptimal decisions that would stop you from stopping them from winning, of course. But it's just an interesting point that I thought on the side of this. Like, it's all about like, not every decision you make at any point is correct, and you shouldn't be berated for it. I'm not saying you can tell someone at the table that their decision was categorically wrong because in the moment it might have seemed correct. But that's the nature of feeding, or intentionally or otherwise, or throwing a game, is that in the moment the choice you made might have seemed the correct one, following emotions, the information you had at the time, and so on and so forth. And then in hindsight, you can be like, actually, that decision was wrong. And I think a lot of people don't do that reflection at the end of a game or after a game, right? Like, what could they have done differently for a different outcome? Because sometimes it doesn't fucking matter because the game is real casual. But if you wanted to just, have a more strategic sort of like game, which is what some of us play this game for, having that reflection is pretty good. Anyway, the other card that leads to horrendous examples of feeding, Tempt with Discovery. Now, the Tempting Offer cycle or collection of cards is a collection of cards that I very much like. You have this thing where you do a thing, then each player at the table may choose to also do the thing, and if they do, you basically get to do the thing again. For every player that does the thing, you get a copy of it. Tempt with Discovery is probably the best one, the one that sees the most play. 4 mana, Tempt with Discovery, search your library for a land card, that's any land, not a basic land by the way, and put it onto the battlefield. Not tapped, by the way, just to clarify how good this card is, raw dog, out of the gate anyway. Each opponent may search their library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield as well. For each opponent who searches their library in this way, search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. Then each player who searched this way shuffles their library. Honestly, 4 mana at sorcery speed, I know, it's not quite crop rotation, but get any land from your deck into play untapped. Wowee, this card is good enough to see play. Maybe not the highest tiers of the game, but I think that's still a strong effect for its mana cost. Get that Fielder deck, get that Cabal Coffers, get that Urborg, get whatever you need, baby. Just a Bajuka Bog. Okay, the Bog still comes into play tap, but whatever, you still get what you need. The problem comes is when the table just breaks down. All bets are off and everyone's too tempted. Like, look, I'm explaining this card leads to like games being thrown or letting other players get hugely disgustingly ahead. Sure, doesn't mean I don't think the design is absolutely fucking fantastic. The Tempt with or Tempting Offer cycle, oh my god, I love these cards. This is what Commander is about. It leads to conversation and discussion. It leads to, hopefully, jovial like disagreements over whether you should be doing a thing. I fucking love that. The political aspect is so good that I make videos on this fucking channel about it. So what happens with Tempt with Discovery is that you go around the table asking if people are going to do it, and there's a conversation about whether or not they should do it, and eventually someone will do it. At which point the other two say fuck it and I'll do it too, and the player casting this has 4 untapped lands, which is at least all their mana like refunded for the spell, and sometimes more so when they get an Ancient Tomb, Cabal Coffers plus Urborg, or fucking Gaia's Cradle. Of course, the power level of Temple of Discovery goes up and up and up, the stronger and better your mana base is and the better utility lands you have. That's not the point. The point here is that this is a card that some people feel like, what's the worst that could happen? And then you absolutely push the game in the favor of the player casting Temple of Discovery. The thing that makes Temple of Discovery different to both Rhystic Study, Smothering Tithe, Esper Sentinel, Mystical War, and all that other shit is that the deed is done. Even less so than the turn 1 Soul Ring, the advantage is had at one particular point. You just get your thing, and then there's no misplaying into Temple of Discovery going forward. However, much like Soul Ring, you get the mana from those lands for the rest of the game. If this is cast on turn 3 or turn 2, or for Mana Rocks and fast mana, those lands are going to have such a huge effect on the game over the next 3 to 5 turns. It's going to be public enemy number 1 with the guy who cast, or the person that cast Temple of Discovery. You could argue that doing that leads the table to look at that person, which allows you to get under everybody and be a mysterious little pixie. The reality is that you are really pushing the game in their favor. You are feeding one player huge amounts of resources. What's the correct play? If player A casts Temple of Discovery and player B says, I am searching, should player C and D say no? Because now they're doubly behind player A in terms of lands, and they're 1 behind player B. That cascading, like, House of Cards falling element is such a wonderful part of the card, but my god, does it feel like feeding. Ultimately, I think these cards are fun to some extent, although I do think that the number of games derailed by a resolved and unrespected Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe is probably higher than any other card in the entirety of Magic the Gathering, which is quite an impressive statement, I guess, but I'm pretty confident of that. And thus it does make me ask, like, are these good for the format? I think overall they are. They get worse and worse the better people play, the more respectfully people play, shall I say. But on that note, let's talk about Smothering Tithe for a second, where Rhystic Study says play 1 mana per spell you cast, which is going to be, 1 to 2 times a turn, or, in other people's turns too. Smothering Tithe says pay 2 mana per card drawn. Like I hinted at earlier, you can never not really do this. You must draw the card in your turn, and thus a Smothering Tithe trigger happens. Beyond that, the cost is 2 mana instead of 1, making it doubly harsh and a massive setback to do so. And then beyond all of that, Smothering Tithe also combos in ways that Rhystic Study doesn't really do. So for example, if you cast a wheel effect that makes everyone draw 7, that means you're going to get 21 triggers on a full table, where Rhystic Study never does any of that shit. And thus Smothering Tithe is the whole another level of obnoxious. Of course, it's not drawing you cards, it's making you mana, which no one's going to argue is better. Drawing cards is the best thing you can do in Magic. Pretty much everyone's going to agree on that. I say pretty much everyone, 99%. But that doesn't really matter because it's so significantly better in the fact that it costs 2 extra and combos with anything that causes your opponents to draw and triggers off every draw. Smothering Tithe is kind of absurd as a Magic card. And I'm not complaining because I lost to it. It was in my deck. I lent the deck to them. I play Smothering Tithe in quite a few of my decks. The card is absurd. So what did I want out of this? I don't know. Maybe a slight shift in how we approach the idea of giving other players at the table resources. The idea that we are collaboratively trying to stop one of the players, or at all times, all 3 are working together to stop the other player from winning. And thus, if you all start feeding them cards off of Rhystic Aurora or giving them mana off Smothering Tithe, you are absolutely fucking that up. The dynamic commander table is deeply fascinating, and hundreds of thousands of words are going to be written on it this year alone. Videos like this, hours and hours of content from people like myself and Trinket Maid and Salburius Snail, is that how you pronounce it? Hell, Moldhound, all those people are always talking about decks and the culture and strategy and the philosophy behind Commander, because multiplayer Magic is fascinating. All I'm saying is stop intentionally feeding. Otherwise, I'm going to type in chat 9 times report. I've been Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi on the internet. I've been playing way too much League of Legends, as you can tell by how it's influenced my thought process on this topic. If you enjoyed the video, let me know in the comment section below. If you have some thoughts on it, let me know down there below as well, because I do follow up from thoughts that I get from comments and social media posts and similar. If you want to play League of Legends with me, you can join my Patreon for just £2 a month, and I play League with members of my Discord server that is accessed through the Patreon. £2 a month, and you can come show me how good you are or bad you are at League of Legends. I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.